You are in Vienna, sometime in the middle of the 18th century. The air carries the faint scent of beeswax and damp stone, the kind that lingers in the long marble corridors of palaces too large for their occupants. Here, in the Hofburg Palace, a young girl is being prepared for a life she cannot yet imagine. Her name is Maria Antonia Josepha Johanna, the 15th child of Empress Maria Theresa of Austria, and one of the youngest in a family that seems to stretch endlessly across the vast empire. Maria Antonia's childhood is not remarkable by royal standards. She is born into opulence, surrounded by music, ceremony, and the quiet weight of dynastic responsibility. The court of Vienna, though magnificent, runs with a strict, bureaucratic rhythm, governed not by passion but by protocol. Days are divided into lessons, meals, and rituals. Tutors come and go. There are endless rules about how to curtsy, how to eat, how to speak. Every movement, every smile, every glance is observed and shaped by etiquette. At first glance, it might seem like an enviable childhood, but for Maria Antonia, it is a gilded education, one where knowledge of mathematics or literature matters less than the ability to hold one's chin at the correct angle during a greeting. Her mother, Maria Theresa, is a formidable ruler, a woman who governs an empire and her household with the same relentless precision. Yet, despite her power, she cannot give her daughter what she needs most: freedom. By the time Maria Antonia is 10, her future is already being drafted in ink across diplomatic letters. The 7 Years' War has just ended, and the shifting alliances of Europe have left Austria searching for stability. France, once its bitter rival, now seems like a necessary friend. The Bourbon and Habsburg dynasties, two ancient houses long at odds, begin to consider the unthinkable, a union between their heirs. For this alliance, a daughter of Austria must be sent to Versailles. At first, it seems Maria Antonia might not be the ideal candidate. She is pretty, yes, with light hair and blue eyes, but not exceptionally bright. Her tutors complain that she struggles with reading and writing, that her French is poor, that she prefers dancing to study. Yet she has something that makes a standout charm. Even at a young age, she can disarm adults with a glance, make courtiers laugh, and turn reprimands into indulgent smiles. It is this quality, not intelligence or piety, that convinces her mother she might do well in France. And so, preparations begin. The process of turning Maria Antonia into Marie Antoinette is methodical. Her tutors are replaced with French instructors. Her hair is restyled. Her clothes are adjusted to the French taste. She practices walking, speaking, and eating in the Parisian manner. Even her teeth are corrected, painfully, by an early orthodontist. The transformation is not merely cosmetic, it is symbolic. Austria is reshaping its daughter to be acceptable to France. When she turns 14, the negotiations are complete. She is betrothed to the Dauphin of France, Louis Auguste, grandson of King Louis XV. He is shy, awkward, and deeply religious, the very opposite of the charming, lively girl chosen to marry him. But such differences are irrelevant. Their union is not about affection or compatibility. It is about politics. The journey from Vienna to Versailles begins in the spring of 1770. As her carriage rolls across the European countryside, Maria Antonia watches towns and villages pass by. Cobbled streets, peasants in the fields, small churches, and forests that stretch into mist. The landscapes are beautiful but distant, belonging to a world she will never inhabit. At each border, the customs of one nation fade, and those of another begin. When she reaches the French border, a curious ritual takes place. In a small wooden pavilion on an island in the Rhine River, she is stripped of everything Austrian. Her attendants remove her clothes, her jewelry, even her small dog. She stands shivering in a bare room while her new French garments are brought in. When she emerges, she is no longer Maria Antonia, she is Marie Antoinette, Dauphine of France. It is a symbolic rebirth, one meant to demonstrate her complete devotion to her new home. Yet it also marks the beginning of her isolation. From this moment on, she belongs to no one entirely, not Austria, not France, not even herself. Her arrival at Versailles is an overwhelming spectacle. The palace, with its endless corridors and gilded mirrors, gleams under the May sun. Thousands of courtiers, servants, and curious onlookers crowd the grand avenues to catch a glimpse of the Austrian princess. She is dressed in silver blue silk, her hair powdered and adorned with diamonds. The crowd cheers, though some whisper that she is too foreign, too young, too Austrian. When she first meets her husband, Louis Auguste, she curtsies deeply as instructed. He stammers awkwardly, then bows. The moment is polite but empty. Two strangers fulfilling a contract neither truly understands. They are married the next day in a ceremony of immense splendor. Bells ring across Paris. Fireworks explode over the gardens of Versailles. But beneath the surface celebration there is unease. France's people are growing restless. The nation is in debt, food prices are rising, and whispers of reform ripple through salons and streets alike. The young Dauphine, oblivious to all this, is swept up in a blur of protocol. Her days are spent learning the complex etiquette of the French court, where every gesture carries meaning. She must be dressed each morning by a circle of noblewomen, each with a rank determining who touches her first. She must smile, curtsy, and speak precisely. Even her meals are public. Dozens of courtiers watch her eat. Privacy, that most human comfort, is a luxury she will never again possess. At night she retires to her gilded rooms, where silence hums like the echo of a forgotten melody. Versailles is beautiful, but it is also suffocating. The air smells faintly of wax, perfume, and decay. Beyond the golden mirrors, mold creeps behind the walls. The servants whisper in corridors, and rumors breed faster than truth. For Marie Antoinette, every smile is both a performance and a defense. Her husband, though kind, is distant. Louis Auguste prefers clocks, locks, and hunting to conversation. Their marriage remains unconsummated for years, a matter of both embarrassment and political anxiety. Ambassadors send reports back to Vienna and Paris, describing the lack of progress in the royal bedchamber. Her mother writes letters filled with advice, encouragement, and impatience. "Be sweet to your husband," she says, "and do not forget why you are there." But Marie Antoinette is still a teenager, bewildered by her duties and the strange coldness of her new life. Gradually, she begins to seek escape. Music, dancing, and friendship offer temporary refuge. She forms a small circle of companions, young nobles who share her taste for laughter, gambling, and late-night gatherings. They call her Madame Deficit, behind her back, though not yet to her face. The people of France, meanwhile, begin to question the extravagance of the court, the endless balls, and the piles of silk that fill the royal wardrobes. It is in these early years that seem gilded on the surface but hollow within, that the seeds of tragedy are quietly sown. The Dauphine's laughter, echoing through the Hall of Mirrors, becomes a symbol of everything distant and careless about the monarchy. She does not yet know it, but every gesture she makes is being recorded in the collective memory of a restless nation. And yet, in her own mind, she is only trying to breathe. Imagine her walking alone through the gardens of Versailles at dusk. The fountains are still, the marble statues pale in the fading light. She pauses by the water, watching her reflection ripple. Behind her, the palace glows with candlelight. Ahead lies the vast, dark expanse of France, a country she rules in name but does not yet understand. She is both powerful and powerless, adored and despised, a symbol and a stranger. The gilded cage has closed around her, though she has not yet noticed the lock. The question, quietly forming in the shadows of Versailles, is this: the first few years of Marie Antoinette's life at Versailles were a slow unraveling of innocence. She had entered the French court as a child of 14, and by the time her husband became king in 1774, she was not yet 20. Louis XV, the aging and scandal-ridden monarch, had died of smallpox, and the court that had once revolved around his whims now turned toward the young couple who suddenly found themselves at the center of a trembling empire. The ceremony of accession was both exhilarating and terrifying. "God help us, we are too young to reign," Louis murmured as they left the funeral of his grandfather. And indeed they were. The kingdom he inherited was vast but unstable, rich in culture yet drowning in debt. Decades of war and extravagance had bled the treasury dry. The American Revolution, still gathering force across the Atlantic, would soon add another weight to the balance. France, in its pursuit of glory and influence, was quietly digging its own grave. Yet within the walls of Versailles, these storms seemed distant. Marie Antoinette, now Queen of France, moved through a world of mirrors and rituals. Her mornings began with the lever, a ritualized awakening attended by dozens of courtiers who performed even the simplest tasks, handing her a gown, passing her gloves, fastening her jewels. At midday came audiences, ceremonies, and public meals. Her every action was observed, recorded, and repeated through whispers in the galleries. But even among such grandeur, she was lonely. Her marriage, though improved, remained uncertain. After 7 years, the union was finally consummated, a matter celebrated as a national event, as though the birth of affection could repair a dynasty. Their first child, Marie Therese, was born in 1778, followed by several others. Still, the young queen's heart sought solace elsewhere, not in rebellion or romance, but in small acts of escape. She began to build her own world within the palace, a sanctuary of simplicity and taste that contrasted sharply with Versailles' suffocating opulence. At the Petit Trianon, a small chateau on the grounds. She created an idealized rural retreat, the Hameau de la Reine, or the Queen's Hamlet. It was a place of fantasy filled with meadows, cottages, and carefully tended gardens. Here she could dress in plain muslin gowns, feed chickens, and stroll without the crushing weight of court protocol. It was her imitation of peasant life, clean, perfumed, and orchestrated, a pastoral dream untouched by real labor or hardship. To the court it was eccentric but forgivable. To the public it became an outrage. The contrast between the Queen's rustic amusements and the growing hunger of Paris was too sharp to ignore. Pamphlets began to circulate, vicious, mocking, scandalous. They portrayed Marie Antoinette as frivolous, immoral, and wasteful. Some accused her of adultery, others of espionage for Austria. Her every gesture was twisted into evidence of indifference or corruption. Even her wardrobe became a political weapon. She abandoned the stiff, formal gowns of French tradition for lighter, more natural styles, airy muslins, ribbons, and unpowdered hair. To her it was freedom. To her critics it was an insult. In a society where fashion was a symbol of hierarchy, her simplicity was perceived as arrogance. She was nicknamed Madame d'Effacit, the embodiment of royal excess and fiscal ruin. But it wasn't all vanity. Marie Antoinette's influence on court culture was profound. She revived French fashion, supported artists, musicians, and architects. She patronized artisans and perfumers, fostering industries that defined the taste of an era. Yet these contributions were invisible beside the tide of resentment rising beyond the gilded gates of Versailles. Meanwhile, France's financial situation worsened. Louis XVI, sincere but indecisive, struggled to implement reforms. His ministers, Turgot Necker, Calonne, each proposed measures to cut spending and tax the privileged classes, but the nobility resisted. Each time, reform was delayed. Each delay deepened the crisis. The king's good intentions were buried under bureaucracy and fear. At court, the Queen was blamed for everything. "It is her," people whispered. "The Austrian woman." They said she drained the treasury for her pleasures, that she plotted with foreign powers, that she cared nothing for the suffering of the poor. The truth was far less dramatic. She simply lived as she had been taught, within a system that demanded display, tradition, and distance. The gap between perception and reality grew wider with each passing year. By the late 1780s, the air in Versailles had changed. The rituals continued, but they felt hollow, like an echo in an empty hall. Even the courtiers sensed something shifting beneath the surface. Bread prices in Paris had doubled, harvests had failed, and the streets murmured with discontent. Philosophers spoke of liberty, equality, and the rights of man. Pamphlets spread faster than royal decrees. The world beyond the mirrors was awakening. In 1789, the Estates General was convened for the first time in 175 years, a desperate attempt to address the financial collapse. Representatives of the three estates, clergy, nobility, and commoners, gathered in Versailles. What began as a political meeting soon turned into a revolution. The Third Estate declared itself the National Assembly, claiming to represent the people. When the king hesitated to recognize them, tensions exploded. Rumors swept through Paris that the royal family planned to suppress the assembly by force. Crowds gathered, angry and armed. On July 14th, they stormed the Bastille, a symbol of royal tyranny, though nearly empty at the time. The fall of the fortress sent shockwaves through France. The old order was crumbling. In Versailles, Marie Antoinette listened to the distant echoes of the revolt. She was now 33, with 4 children and a face that had begun to lose its youthful glow. Yet her spirit, though proud, was wary. She spent her nights pacing the marble halls, her days filled with anxious meetings. The courtiers who once flattered her now avoided her eyes. Even those loyal to the crown whispered of danger. The royal family's world had become a stage for revolution. On October 5, 1789, a mob of market women, armed with knives, muskets, and drums, marched from Paris to Versailles in the pouring rain. They demanded bread, and the king's attention. The sound of their chanting echoed through the palace corridors like a prophecy. When the crowd broke into the queen's apartments, her guards fought to protect her. She fled barefoot through hidden passages to the king's chambers, clutching her children. Outside, chaos reigned. By morning, the royal couple stood before the crowd on a balcony, pale and trembling. The people shouted for the king to go to Paris. He bowed his head. "We will go," he said. As their carriage rolled toward the capital, surrounded by armed revolutionaries, Marie Antoinette gazed out at the endless procession of people. Their faces were hard, hungry, determined. The gilded cage of Versailles had shattered, and beyond its ruins lay a France she had never truly seen. The palace they left behind would soon stand empty, its halls echoing with dust and memory. In Paris, they were installed in the Tuileries Palace, under the watchful eyes of the Revolution. It was not imprisonment, not yet, but it was confinement. The Queen's every move was monitored, her letters read, her visitors restricted. She wrote to her family in Austria, her words increasingly desperate. "We are prisoners," she confessed. "I fear for my children." Still, she tried to maintain dignity. Each morning she dressed as though the court still existed. She smiled when watched, though the smiles grew brittle. The queen of fashion had become the queen of endurance. Outside the palace walls, the revolution was consuming itself. Factions formed and broke apart: Girondins, Jacobins, royalists, radicals. Each claimed to speak for the people. Each distrusted the others. Fear and anger spread through the streets like wildfire. The monarchy, once divine, now seemed mortal, vulnerable, obsolete. For the first time in her life, Marie Antoinette experienced the closeness of ordinary people. She heard their voices through the palace gates, their shouts and their songs. She smelled the smoke of their torches at night. She saw from her windows the faces of the city, not painted courtiers, but the true France bakers, soldiers, mothers, beggars. She had been raised to represent them, yet she had never known them. Now, in her quiet hours, she wondered what they truly wanted: bread, freedom, or vengeance. History rarely pauses for reflection, but imagine her there, seated at a small desk by candlelight, the faint smell of tallow and ink around her. Her handwriting wavers slightly as she composes a letter to her brother, the Emperor of Austria. She writes of fear, of duty, of the impossible balance between loyalty to her husband and the survival of her children. The wax seal cools, the letter is sent, and the Queen returns to her restless waiting. The people outside grow louder. The cries for liberty are now mixed with demands for justice and for blood. The court of Versailles, once a mirror of divine perfection, has become a ghost of the past, and still, in the Tuileries, the Queen waits. The Tuileries Palace in Paris was never meant to be a home. It was a political cage built of cold stone and empty ceremony, a symbol of a monarchy that no longer ruled. For 3 years, Marie Antoinette lived there under constant surveillance. The courtyards echoed with soldiers' boots, the windows with the chants of the people. Every morning began not with music or prayer, but with the sounds of a city learning how to live without a king. Inside the palace, life was suspended between hope and despair. The royal family maintained a routine, a fragile illusion of normalcy. Louis XVI rose early, attended prayers, and studied geography and mechanics, as though still preparing to govern. The children had lessons. The Queen read Sud and wrote letters. Yet the walls felt closer each day, the air heavier. Courtiers whispered of escape, while revolutionaries whispered of trials and punishment. In public, Marie Antoinette was defiant. She appeared on balconies with dignity, dressed with care, her expression calm. In private, she was anxious and pale, her hair turning white before her time. The woman once mocked for her vanity was now reduced to survival. No jewels, no silk, only the dignity of restraint. The first escape attempt came in June 1791. It was planned with precision-forged passports, disguises, a waiting carriage. The family would flee to the northeastern frontier, where loyal troops awaited them. The plan, known as the flight to Varennes, was meant to save not only the royals, but perhaps the monarchy itself. On the night of June 20th, the carriage rolled quietly out of Paris. The Queen wore a simple bonnet, her children sleeping beside her. For hours they moved through the countryside in silence, the horses' hooves muffled against the dirt road. But delays and indecision slowed their progress. At dawn, as they neared the town of Varennes, they were recognized. A postmaster, suspicious of their appearance, alerted the local militia. By midnight, they were surrounded. The king revealed his identity, a fatal mistake of pride or perhaps honesty. The next day, under guard and humiliation, the royal family was escorted back to Paris. Crowds lined the roads, silent and grim. The Queen sat with her head bowed, her hands trembling in her lap. A young officer who witnessed the procession wrote, "They looked less like sovereigns returning to their palace than prisoners returning to their cell." After Varennes, the monarchy was finished in all but name. The revolution had shown the people that their rulers could flee and fail. The National Assembly stripped the royal family of authority, placing them under house arrest. The king was forced to swear loyalty to the Constitution of 1791, reducing him to a figurehead. The Queen's influence, once subtle and pervasive, was now poison to any who approached her. Yet even in captivity, she remained a symbol. To her enemies, she represented tyranny, excess, and betrayal. To her supporters, she was courage itself, Letters from Austrian and Royalist sympathizers reached her in secret, but most offered only words. No army marched, no rescue came. By 1792, France was at war with Austria and Prussia. The revolutionaries feared that the Queen was conspiring with foreign powers, and not without reason. She did send letters, pleading for intervention. Though her aim was not revenge but safety for her children, the war went poorly. French defeats abroad and unrest in Paris fed each other in a spiral of panic. On August 10, 1792, the storm broke. A mob of insurgents, joined by National Guardsmen, attacked the Tuileries Palace. The Swiss Guards, loyal to the crown, fought desperately but were overwhelmed. Blood ran through the marble halls. The royal family escaped through a hidden passage to the Legislative Assembly, seeking protection. But there was none left to give. That night, the monarchy was officially suspended. The following month, it was abolished. The age of kings had ended. The family was transferred to the Temple, a medieval fortress turned prison. Here, stripped of titles, they became simply Louis Capet, Marie Antoinette, and their children. The guards addressed them as citizens. Meals were plain, light was limited, and privacy non-existent. The Queen now slept on a narrow cot beside her daughter, her dresses coarse and unadorned. Her husband prayed quietly in the adjoining cell. In the stillness of those nights, she must have felt time stretching thin. Each hour the same, each sound amplified. The footsteps of guards, the distant laughter of soldiers, the faint whisper of her son's breathing. Once, Versailles had seemed endless. Now her entire world was a few stone rooms and a locked door. On January 21, 1793, Louis Exvier was executed. He climbed the scaffold calmly, addressing the crowd with dignity. The drums drowned his final words. The blade fell, and with it, the last illusion of monarchy in France. When the Queen heard the news, she did not faint or scream. She closed her eyes, and according to witnesses, whispered a prayer. From that moment, she was no longer the Queen of France. She was the widow Capet. The days that followed were quieter but darker. Her son, the young Louis Charles, was taken from her and placed under the care of a revolutionary jailer who sought to, or educate, him as a good citizen. He was beaten, isolated, and forced to denounce his mother. The Queen, hearing his cries through the walls, could do nothing. Her daughter, Marie Therese, became her only companion. The two women sitting side by side in the dim light, mending clothes and reading scraps of old newspapers that hinted at the outside world. For months, the Queen awaited trial, her name used in every faction's propaganda. To some, she was the she-wolf of Austria, to others, the grieving widow. In October 1793, her turn came. Her trial before the Revolutionary Tribunal was swift and merciless. The charges included treason, conspiracy, and theft, but the most damning and cruelest was an accusation of incest with her son, fabricated by her jailers. When asked how she responded, she rose from her seat, pale and trembling, and said only, "If I have not replied, it is because nature itself refuses to answer such a charge." Even the women in the courtroom, hardened by revolution, murmured in sympathy, but sympathy could not save her. The verdict was predetermined. On October 16, 1793, she was sentenced to death. At dawn, she dressed carefully for the last time. She refused the mourning black of a widow and instead chose a plain white gown, the color of purity and of the Bourbons. She tied her hair back to keep it from the blade. Her hands were bound behind her. As she stepped into the waiting cart, she glanced once toward the temple, where her daughter remained imprisoned. Then she turned her face forward. The ride to the Place de la Révolution lasted about an hour. The streets were filled with people, but there was little noise. Witnesses described her as calm, even serene. The once glittering Queen now sat upright, her eyes steady, her posture unbroken. The revolution had stripped her of everything but her composure. When she reached the scaffold, she accidentally stepped on the executioner's foot and murmured, "Pardon me, sir. I did not do it on purpose." Those were her final words. At 12:15 p.m. the blade fell. The crowd cheered, though not with triumph, more with exhaustion. The air smelled of iron and smoke. A few strands of her white hair clung to the wood of the guillotine. The executioner held a head aloft, and the drums began again. Thus ended the life of Marie Antoinette, Archduchess of Austria, Queen of France, mother, symbol, scapegoat. She had been loved, hated, mocked, and mourned, but perhaps never truly understood. Years later, those who had known her in captivity spoke of her dignity, her silence, her unshackable poise. She had become something quieter, simpler, more human than the caricature painted by her enemies. The queen of fashion died as a woman stripped of all adornment, and in that, perhaps, she became real at last. The revolution itself devoured many who had condemned her, The reign of terror consumed its own architects, Robespierre, Danton, and others met the same blade that had ended her life. By the end of the decade, France was once again ruled by a single man, Napoleon Bonaparte, who restored many of the trappings of monarchy under a different name. The story of Marie Antoinette remains one of contradictions. She was both prisoner and participant, victim and emblem of privilege. Her life reminds us that history rarely divides neatly into good and evil, hero and villain. It moves instead through shades of misunderstanding, the soft, unseen spaces between intention and perception. Imagine for a moment the silence after her death, the cart rolling away, the square slowly emptying, the echo of footsteps fading down a Paris street lined with bare trees. Somewhere beyond the sound of drums, life goes on. Bakers lighting ovens, children playing, the city breathing again. History forgets quickly, but the faint outline of her story remains, a quiet reminder of how fragile grandeur can be and how swiftly it can dissolve into dust. The gilded cage is empty now. The mirrors of Versailles reflect only ghosts. The world, as we know it, began as a series of guesses. Before satellites, before compasses settled into certainty, before longitude could be measured with clocks, people drew the shape of the earth not as it was, but as they imagined it to be. And so, for centuries, the world existed first as ink on vellum. If you could hold one of those maps in your hands, perhaps a 14th century mappa mundi, drawn in an abbey somewhere in England or on a desk in Venice, you would see not geography, but theology. The world would appear round, but not as a globe, rather, a flat circle surrounded by water, like a plate floating in an endless sea. Jerusalem would sit at the center, glowing with divine importance. Paradise, the Garden of Eden, might be tucked into a corner, beyond the rivers of the east. Monsters would crawl along the edges, dog-headed men, cyclops, or races that ate only the scent of apples. And yet, these maps were not jokes. They were acts of devotion. Each line drawn was an attempt to impose order on the unknown, to make the chaotic vastness of creation into something a monk could study, trace, and perhaps even believe in. The world as belief mapmaking in those centuries was not a profession but a prayer. The men, and occasionally women, who created them were often clerics copying older texts by candlelight. They worked in scriptoria, hunched over animal skin, quills whispering across parchment. They did not travel, not usually. Many had never seen the ocean or the desert, only heard about them in scripture or through the rumors of merchants and pilgrims. The maps they made were circular because perfection, in their understanding, was circular. The world was not measured but symbolized. The land of the living and the realm of heaven were linked by geometry rather than geography. In the Hereford Mappa Mundi, for example, one of the few surviving Great World maps of the Middle Ages, the continents sprawl awkwardly across the parchment. Asia sits at the top, Europe and Africa beneath, all encircled by an ocean. It is less a depiction than a meditation, filled with drawings of cities, saints, and stories. The map does not tell you where to go, it tells you what to believe. In this sense, every error was deliberate. Accuracy was irrelevant if meaning was preserved. Still, there were those who sought more than faith from their maps. Venice, Genoa, and other trading cities began to demand charts that could guide ships, not souls. And so, in workshops smelling faintly of ink, salt, and glue, a new kind of map began to emerge, the portolan chart. The age of the compass rose, the portolan was practical, almost shockingly so compared to the medieval Mappa Mundi. It appeared in the Mediterranean around the 13th century and was unlike anything before it. Instead of saints and dragons, it showed coastlines, harbors, and compass lines, hundreds of them, radiating from colorful roses painted across the sea. These charts were designed not for contemplation, but for navigation. Sailors, tracing routes from Genoa to Alexandria or from Lisbon to Bruges, could use them to measure directions between ports. Distances, though still uncertain, were at least plausible. The world was shrinking, not in reality, but in perception. The mapmakers, called cartai, were artisans rather than theologians. They worked by lamplight, copying coastlines from earlier charts, comparing notes from ship captains, and occasionally inventing details to fill empty spaces. Mistakes multiplied with each copy. A misplaced cape, a doubled island, a stretch of coastline turned upside down, all could be replicated 100 times over as charts were traded, copied, and sold. But nobody minded. What mattered was confidence, not precision. A good chart made sailors feel that the world could be understood, even if it could not yet be measured. And so the world, by accident, began to be drawn wrong, consistently wrong, reliably wrong, and beautifully wrong. One of the most enduring of these errors was the island of California. It began as a rumor, perhaps from early Spanish explorers who mistook the Boja Peninsula for an island. A single cartographer sketched it that way, and for 2 centuries, mapmakers repeated it faithfully. Ships sailed around imaginary capes and traded along coastlines that did not exist. No one corrected the mistake for generations, because no one wanted to admit they didn't know. Error in mapmaking became tradition. The power of the unknown to draw a map was to claim authority. Kings commissioned them to define borders, popes to describe Christendom, merchants to justify voyages. Every line on a map was an act of control, a statement that said, "This is ours, this is known." And yet, for all their certainty, mapmakers knew the limits of their own work. Many of them left blank spaces marked "Exunt Dracons," "Here be dragons." The phrase was less literal than emotional. It meant, beyond this point, I do not know. Those blank spaces were not failures. They were honesty, the last breath of humility before the Enlightenment began to demand precision. In the 15th century, that humility began to fade. The Portuguese, driven by curiosity and competition, launched fleets along the coast of Africa. Their explorers brought back new data, the true shape of capes, the scale of oceans, the direction of currents. Cartographers, suddenly, had to choose between faith and evidence. They began to stretch their coastlines downward, adding the curving Horn of Africa, the imagined passage to India, the faint outline of unknown lands. The maps were becoming modern, still wrong, but increasingly aware of their wrongness. And as they changed, so did the men who made them. The mapmaker was no longer a monk but a mathematician, a sailor, a craftsman of instruments and ink. He carried compasses, rulers, and globes instead of psalters. He measured, calculated, and corrected. But in doing so, he also made new mistakes, subtler ones harder to see but just as lasting. The early world maps drawn by the Portuguese and Spanish explorers, for instance, relied on magnetic compasses and rough estimates of distance at sea. Longitude could not be measured accurately, so coastlines appeared stretched or compressed, islands drifted miles from their true positions, and entire continents seemed shifted on the parchment. When Columbus set out in 1492, he was following maps that underestimated the width of the Atlantic by nearly half. The world he sailed into was not the one he expected, but the one his map had promised. He never found Asia, but his map said he had. And because the maps said so, the error endured. Cartography by then had become an instrument of empire. Errors were no longer accidents. They were politics. A misplaced boundary could mean the difference between peace and war, between claim and conquest. To redraw a map was to reshape reality itself. Still, within those errors lay beauty. The maps of the Renaissance are breathtaking, not for their accuracy but for their imagination. The seas shimmer with inked waves, ships dance along the margins, and continents are framed with vines and angels. They are as much art as science, caught in the delicate tension between truth and wonder. And in every one of them, you can see the human desire to know and to believe, fighting quietly against the limits of knowledge. If you could stand in one of those workshops, perhaps in Florence, or Lisbon, or Antwerp, you would hear the soft rhythm of pen against parchment. You would smell the sharp tang of gall ink and the faint sweetness of varnish. The mapmaker bends close to his work, candlelight trembling on his fingers. Outside, the world is vast, unknowable, infinite. But here, within a few square feet of skin and ink, it can be made small enough to hold. He pauses, draws a line, then another. A coastline emerges, not as it is, but as he imagines it should be. When he finishes, he sets down his quill and blows gently on the drying ink. For a moment, he believes he has captured the world. But the world, quietly, has already changed. And so, by the end of the 15th century, humanity stood on the edge of discovery, with maps that were wrong in every direction, yet powerful enough to send ships into the unknown. The next age would be one of correction, conquest, and curiosity, when error itself became the engine of exploration. The dawn of the 16th century arrived not with the quiet scratching of quills, but with the roar of cannon and the creak of timber hulls. The age of discovery, though it was, in truth, an age of relentless mistake, had begun. Maps were no longer devotional curiosities or sailors' guides. They were instruments of domination, folded into the heart of European ambition. To draw the world was now to divide it. The line that split the world in 1494, only 2 years after Columbus's first voyage, Pope Alexander VI issued a decree that sliced the earth in half. The Treaty of Tordesillas drew a single, invisible line down the Atlantic Ocean. Spain would claim everything west of it, Portugal everything east. But here lies the irony. No one actually knew where the line was. Longitude, that stubborn measure of east and west, was still beyond human capability. The Earth could not be divided accurately, because no one could yet measure the Earth accurately. Yet this invisible line, defined by guesswork, would determine the fates of continents. Portuguese cartographers drew the line one way, Spanish ones drew it another. The difference could span hundreds of miles, enough to decide who owned Brazil, or the Spice Islands, or the Philippines. Empires, it turned out, were founded not just on steel and sail, but on ink. And so, in the offices of Lisbon and Seville, men who had never seen the open sea argued over parchment. They redrew the world with compasses and rulers, insisting that their version of the line was true. Every correction was political, every error was deliberate. Maps had become weapons, wielded quietly but effectively. The map room, imagine one of those rooms, perhaps in 16th century Lisbon. A vaulted ceiling, walls lined with charts rolled in tubes of linen and leather. The air smells of oil and dust. At the center stands a table, and on it lies a map the size of a door, the known world, drawn in ochres and blues. Around it a circle of men, cosmographers, as they were called, lean over the parchment murmuring. Their compasses trace arcs across oceans, their dividers measure distances between imagined ports. They compare routes of voyages, debate latitudes, and quietly amend coastlines that have yet to be seen. Each map was a living document, a blend of testimony, speculation, and artistry. It recorded not what was known, but what was hoped for. Ships sailed according to these hopes. Captains steered toward imagined islands. Antillia, High Brazil, the Isles of the Blessed, chasing profits that existed only in ink. When they returned, they often brought corrections. The coast was farther south, the bay was deeper, the strait did not exist. The mapmakers listened, adjusted, and in doing so, redefined the edge of the known world. The process was endless: draw, explore, revise, repeat. Yet each revision carried the ghost of the last. Old mistakes clung stubbornly to new maps, like the faint shadows of erased lines. That is why, even in the 17th century, long after the Americas were crossed and charted, California was still shown as an island. The age of projection. As exploration expanded, so too did the need for precision. Mapmakers faced a fundamental problem: how to draw a sphere on a flat surface. The Earth, after all, is curved. To flatten it, one must choose what to sacrifice: a shape, area, or direction. No projection could preserve them all. Enter Gerardus Mercator, a quiet Flemish cartographer born in 1512. He was not a sailor or a statesman, but a scholar obsessed with geometry. In 1569 he unveiled his world map, the Mercator projection, which would for centuries define how humanity imagined its own planet. Mercator's genius was in compromise. His projection preserved angles, making it perfect for navigation. Sailors could draw straight lines and follow constant compass bearings. But the price was distortion, massive distortion. Near the equator, his map was fairly accurate. But toward the poles, the land exploded in size. Greenland swelled to rival Africa, Europe loomed enormous. The global balance of space itself was tilted northward. And so, with pure mathematical intent, Mercator accidentally enshrined a worldview, one in which Europe appeared larger, more central, more powerful than it truly was. His map was not wrong, it was simply useful. And usefulness, in the history of maps, has always mattered more than truth. The cartographer's silence. It is tempting to imagine that cartographers were celebrated figures, scientists of renown, pioneers of knowledge. In truth, most lived quietly, their names forgotten even as their maps reshaped nations. They worked in the background of empire, anonymous hands drafting borders others would die for. Their lives were measured not in voyages, but in revisions. One such man was Diego Ribeiro, the Spanish cartographer who, in 1529, created one of the first scientifically based world maps. He used reports from Magellan's circumnavigation, astronomical data, and coastal surveys to produce something astonishingly accurate for its time. Yet even Ribeiro could not resolve the longitude problem. His map placed the Americas too close to Asia, his Pacific too narrow. Still, his work was classified as a state secret. It was not knowledge for the world, it was knowledge for the crown. The mapmaker's ink, once an act of faith, had become an act of secrecy. In the age of colonization, maps became instruments of theft. Lands were claimed by drawing them. Indigenous territories, long inhabited and known, were erased under European lines. Forests, rivers, and mountains became property through cartography. The pen, quietly and elegantly, replaced the sword. A blank map, in this context, was an invitation, not to wonder but to conquer. The long shadow of error. By the 17th century, European maps had become more precise but still imperfect. The latitude of cities could be measured with stars, but longitude, the east-west measure, remained elusive. Even the best charts could be off by hundreds of miles. Ships disappeared chasing phantom islands, nations disputed over invisible lines. In 1714, the British government finally offered a reward, the famous Longitude Prize, for anyone who could devise a method to measure longitude accurately at sea. It would take decades, and the quiet work of a clockmaker named John Harrison to solve it. But that is a story for later. What matters here is that the maps of the 16th and 17th centuries, though riddled with flaws, became the foundation for modern geography. Their inaccuracies were copied into atlases, carved into globes, and printed on parchment that would outlast their creators. Even today, echoes of those old eras remain. Borderlines drawn in the colonial age still define nations. Misjudged coastlines shaped economies. Entire regions owe their political identity to cartographic misunderstanding. The world, in its way, was built upon beautiful mistakes. The human scale of precision, to understand the quiet persistence of these errors. Imagine again the mapmaker's desk. It is evening. A candle flickers near his elbow. He dips his quill into a small pot of ink made from oak galls and iron salts. The ink is thick, almost black. Across from him lies a sheet of vellum stretched taut and pinned to the board. He draws a faint line, measuring degrees with dividers. He copies from another chart. Perhaps from memory, perhaps from rumor. Each pen stroke is deliberate, almost meditative. The coastline of Africa begins to curve downward. The ink spreads slightly, feathering into the skin. He pauses, blots, continues. Outside, the city sleeps. The only sound is the scratching of quill and the beating of his own heart. He will never see the places he draws. But he believes that by drawing them, he understands them. And perhaps, in that belief, he is not entirely wrong. For maps were never just about accuracy. They were about orientation, not only in space, but in meaning. To draw the world was to locate oneself within it. And so, for the mapmaker, every mistake carried a kind of truth. Each distortion reflected not what the Earth was, but what humanity wanted it to be. Ordered, measurable, certain. Yet, as the 17th century gave way to the Enlightenment, that quiet faith began to erode. Maps were no longer prayers or power plays alone. They were becoming scientific instruments, and with science came a new kind of obsession, the need to correct everything. As the map makers of the 18th century prepared their grids and their globes, a question lingered quietly in the candlelit rooms of their predecessors. The 18th century opened like a map being slowly unrolled. By now, the old eras of the medieval and Renaissance charts had become legends of their own. The world had been measured, named, and largely claimed. And yet, as the boundaries hardened, a curious melancholy entered the art of mapmaking. The age of discovery, for all its cruelty and conquest, had been an age of wonder. The new age, the Enlightenment, would replace wonder with measurement. The mapmakers were no longer monks or mystics, but surveyors, engineers, and astronomers. They worked not in monasteries or merchant shops, but in government offices and military academies. Their maps no longer floated between myth and faith. They were drawn to scale, divided by grids, and printed in neat editions for bureaucrats and generals. It was, at last, the triumph of accuracy and the death of imagination. The measured world, the great project of the 18th century, was to measure the Earth itself. In France, the Académie des Sciences began a series of expeditions to determine the planet's exact shape. Was it a perfect sphere, a flattened sphere, or perhaps elongated like an olive? The question was not philosophical, it was practical. Every accurate map depended on knowing the curvature of the Earth. In 1736, 2 expeditions set out simultaneously, one to Lapland, near the Arctic Circle, and one to what is now Ecuador, near the equator. They carried telescopes, pendulums, and endless crates of measuring rods. Their goal was to triangulate, to measure the arc of the meridian, and thus to determine the Earth's dimensions. It took years. Men suffered frostbite in the north and fever in the tropics. Equipment broke, data was lost, arguments flared. When the results finally came back, the verdict was clear: the Earth was not a perfect sphere, but slightly flattened at the poles, a subtle imperfection that would ripple through every map to come. And so began the slow transformation of mapmaking into science. The romantic cartographer, guided by hearsay and artistry, gave way to the geodesist, armed with instruments and mathematics. Yet in this transition, something quiet and human was lost. The new maps, though precise, lacked the warmth of their predecessors. They did not tell stories. They did not imagine monsters in the margins or angels above the oceans. They presented the world as numbers and lines, as property and potential, a planet ready to be surveyed, divided, and managed. The empire of accuracy, the Enlightenment's passion for precision, coincided with the rise of empire. Britain, France, and Spain, soon joined by Russia and the new United States, needed maps not for curiosity but for control. To govern a colony, one first had to draw it. To collect taxes, one had to measure land. To conquer, one had to chart the roads and rivers that armies would use. Thus, cartography became the quiet language of imperial administration. Every new line drawn on a map was a future border, every survey a claim of ownership. The British Ordnance Survey, one of the most ambitious mapping projects in history, began in the late 18th century. Its purpose was military at first, to map Ireland after rebellion, to prepare for a possible French invasion. But soon, it spread to the entire British Isles. Teams of surveyors, carrying tripods and theodolites, fanned out across the countryside. They climbed hills, measured baselines, and triangulated across miles. Each map took years to complete. The result was astonishing: an entire nation, captured in exact scale, every hedgerow and church spire precisely placed. But precision came with an unexpected side effect. Once a place was measured, it seemed somehow smaller. Its mystery evaporated under the grid lines. The French, too, undertook vast mapping efforts, not only of France, but of its colonies. The maps were tools of exploitation disguised as instruments of knowledge. In Africa, Asia, and the Americas, surveyors redrew landscapes that had already been known, lived in, and named for centuries by their inhabitants. Indigenous territories became empty spaces, villages became dots, cultures became footnotes. The map, once a mirror of imagination, had become a mirror of power. The cost of certainty: by the 19th century, nearly every corner of the world had been mapped, at least in outline. The great blank spaces that had once filled maps, the vast unknown interiors of continents, began to disappear. In 1859, the English explorer David Livingstone lamented that Africa was a white blot on European maps. Within decades, that blot was filled, not by discovery but by conquest. The so-called scramble for Africa, beginning in the 1880s, was not only a political event but a cartographic one. In Berlin, diplomats drew lines across the continent on paper maps, dividing lands they had never seen. Those lines, many of them drawn in haste and ignorance, still define the borders of nations today. Once again, error became destiny. A river misplaced by a few miles might separate two countries. A misunderstood mountain range might become a permanent boundary. What had begun as an act of curiosity in medieval monasteries ended as an act of geopolitical violence in colonial offices. The mapmakers of the 19th century, for all their instruments and surveys, were still haunted by the old truth that every line drawn is also a choice, a simplification, a claim, a story told at someone else's expense. And yet, the maps were beautiful. The atlases of the 19th century, vast, leather-bound, hand-colored, were masterpieces of craft. The lines were clean, the typography elegant, the seas shaded in pale blue. To open one was to feel the illusion of mastery, the sense that the entire world could be contained between two covers. But beneath that illusion lay the same fragile faith that had guided the first monkish mapmakers, that to draw something is to understand it. The end of the blank spaces: by the end of the 19th century, there were almost no unknown places left. The poles had yet to be reached, the ocean floors unmapped, but the surface of the world, the land we live upon, had been measured, labeled, and named. For the first time in history, a person could look at a map and believe it was complete. And yet, many found this completeness oddly unsatisfying. Explorers still sought mystery. Writers and dreamers began to look inward, to map the human mind, the heart, the atom, the unseen. Cartography, in a sense, turned metaphysical. The blank spaces had not disappeared, they had simply moved. The map and the mirror: if you look at a modern map, precise, digital, glowing on a screen, you might imagine it is the end of that story. But even today, maps remain slightly wrong. Borders are disputed. Names are contested. Satellite imagery distorts terrain depending on perspective. Some nations appear larger or smaller depending on projection. Echoes of Mercator's bias still persist. And beneath every pixel, every coordinate, lies the same quiet human impulse to draw meaning from the vastness around us. When a medieval monk placed Jerusalem at the center of his world, he was not describing geography, he was describing hope. When a Venetian sailor drew coastlines from rumor, he was drawing courage. When an imperial surveyor measured fields by the inch, he was drawing control. And when we trace the lines of our digital maps today, we are still doing the same thing, trying to make the unknowable feel known. The ink has changed, the parchment has become glass, but the impulse remains. Because in the end, every map, whether painted, printed, or digital, is less about where we are and more about who we believe ourselves to be. The candles are out now. The map lies flat on the table. a delicate network of lines that once represented an entire planet. Outside, the real world stretches vast and indifferent, its mountains older than any measurement, its seas deeper than any line of ink. The mapmaker's hand has stilled, the ink has dried, but the world, the true, boundless, unteady world, continues to unfold, far beyond the edges of every chart. The first sound of morning in Paris, before the bells of the churches or the rumble of carts on cobblestone, was the knock of a baker's paddle against the oven door. Bread was the heartbeat of the city, steady, necessary, almost sacred. Every quarter, from the crowded alleys of Saint Antoine to the narrow streets near the Seine, began its day with the smell of dough rising in the dark. To the people of Paris, bread was not food, it was life itself. A worker ate nearly 2 pounds of it every day. A family might spend half its income on flour. When the price of grain rose, the city trembled. When it fell, the city breathed again. And so, in those decades before the French Revolution, when kings ruled and taxes multiplied, the fate of an empire rested quietly on the shoulders of men and women who kneaded dough in the early hours, their aprons dusted white, their hands cracked from heat and flour. The art and labor of the baker. To be a baker in 18th century Paris was both a privilege and a burden. The Guild of Bakers, the Corporation des Boulangers, was one of the oldest and most regulated professions in France. It required years of apprenticeship, expensive licenses, and strict obedience to rules set by the crown and the city. A baker's day began long before dawn. In cellars that smelled of yeast and smoke, the apprentices mixed flour and water, turning heavy dough with wooden paddles until it grew smooth and elastic. The master baker judged by feel, not measurement. Too little water, and the bread would be dense; too much, and it would collapse in the oven. The ovens themselves were ancient things, great vaulted mouths of brick and ash, heated with bundles of wood carried in from the countryside. The city forbade bakers from keeping fires overnight, fearing that a single spark could destroy entire neighborhoods. So every morning, they began again from cold stone, feeding the fire until it glowed white and hot. The loaves that emerged were round and heavy, called pain de ménage, household bread. The crusts were thick, the color deep brown, the flavor slightly sour from the long fermentation. Bread was sold by weight, not by piece, and inspectors roamed the markets to ensure that no baker cheated his customers with light loaves. Yet despite the vigilance, cheating was common, not out of greed, but necessity. The grain and the crown, the true masters of Parisian bread, were not the bakers, but the bureaucrats. Grain, the soul of bread, was tightly controlled by the crown. Prices were set, trade restricted, and taxes piled upon every sack that entered the city gates. The police du grain, a network of inspectors and administrators, monitored the movement of flour with a precision that bordered on obsession. The government's reasoning was simple: control bread, control the people. For centuries, the French monarchy had understood that the surest path to riot was an empty bakery. When famine struck, mobs did not march to the palace, they marched to the boulangerie. And so, each year, the king's ministers balanced on a delicate wire, keeping prices low enough to prevent hunger, but high enough to appease the farmers and millers who supplied the grain. It was a system that worked barely so long as the harvests were good. But nature is indifferent to politics. The bad harvests in the 1760s and 1770s, the weather turned against France. Cold winters, wet springs, and blighted wheat spread across the countryside. Fields that had once yielded abundance produced only disappointment. The price of grain rose, so too did the price of bread. In Paris, queues formed before dawn outside the bakeries. Mothers stood in line for hours, clutching coins in their aprons. Some fainted before their turn came. Bakers, fearing riot, posted guards at their doors. When the ovens ran empty, the people blamed everyone: the bakers for hoarding, the merchants for profiteering, the king for indifference. Rumors spread that the government was hiding grain in secret warehouses or exporting it abroad to starve the poor into submission. None of it was true. But in times of hunger, truth matters less than fear. In 1775, after yet another failed harvest, the discontent boiled over into what became known as the Flour War. The Flour War, it began, as revolts often do, with rumor. In towns around Paris, word spread that grain convoys were being diverted by corrupt officials. Crowds gathered, seizing carts, breaking into granaries, and selling the flour themselves at what they deemed a fair price. The unrest spread like fire. The government, terrified, sent soldiers. The result was chaos, clashes, arrests, and the quiet return of hunger. Though the rebellion was quickly crushed, it left a scar. For the first time, ordinary citizens had risen not against a foreign power or a nobleman, but against the invisible machinery of the state, the system that determined who would eat and who would not. And in the middle of it all stood the baker. He was both victim and symbol, accused of greed, yet himself squeezed by taxes, regulations, and shortages. His shop became the stage upon which the drama of survival played out daily. The everyday revolution in the narrow lanes of Paris. Bread remained the currency of life. A worker earning 15 sous a day might pay 12 for bread alone. If prices rose even a few sous, the balance of existence collapsed. To walk through a marketplace in those years was to hear the slow tension of a society on the edge. Housewives haggled fiercely, counting each coin twice. Bakers muttered that the inspectors demanded bribes. Farmers arriving from the countryside whispered that the city's appetite was insatiable. And always, somewhere in the background, a rumor of reform, a minister promising free trade in grain, another restoring the controls, another proposing a tax to fix it all. Each new law, however well-intentioned, only deepened the confusion. In 1774, the economist Anne Robert Turgot, a disciple of Enlightenment thought, persuaded the new King Louis XVI to liberalize the grain market, to let prices find their own level. It was a bold experiment in economic philosophy. But when the harvest failed again the next year, prices soared, bread riots returned. The people did not care for the theories of economists. They cared only for bread. Turgot was dismissed, his reforms undone, but the idea lingered. That perhaps the problem was not nature or policy, but the entire structure of privilege and taxation that lay above the people like a weight of stone. The invisible tax. Bread was taxed at every stage. The farmer who grew the wheat paid dues to his lord and tithers to the church. The miller paid for his license to grind. The merchant paid for the right to transport grain into the city. The baker paid again for permission to sell it. By the time a loaf reached the table of a Parisian family, its price carried the burden of an entire hierarchy. The nobility and clergy, exempt from many taxes themselves, lived from the labor of those who could barely afford to eat. It was not simply hunger that gnawed at the people, it was the knowledge that others ate better and paid less. The seeds of revolution by the 1780s, that knowledge had hardened into resentment. The talk in the bakeries, those crowded, flour-scented meeting places, turned increasingly bitter. Bread had become political. Every loaf was a symbol of injustice, every empty shelf an accusation. When harvests failed again in 1788, and the winter that followed was among the coldest in living memory, the price of bread rose to unprecedented heights. Families pawned furniture, ate scraps, begged in the streets. In February 1789, mobs looted bakeries, crying that the government had betrayed them. That spring, the Estates General was called for the first time in over a century, a political gathering born from financial crisis. But in the streets, the crisis was not of budgets or debt, it was of hunger. The revolution that would soon shake the world began not with slogans, but with the slow, ordinary agony of trying to buy a loaf of bread. And somewhere in a small shop along the Rue Saint-Honoré, a baker wiped the sweat from his brow and wondered how much longer he could sell at a loss before his own children went hungry. He did not yet know that, within a year, the people who'd bought his bread would march to Versailles, and that bread itself would become the rallying cry of a revolution. The ovens are still glowing, the lines still forming, the air thick with the scent of flour and fear, and as the city begins to tremble under the weight of hunger, one question echoes through every street and cellar. The summer of 1789 began with hunger, it ended with history. Between those 2 points, between the hunger that drove the people to desperation and the storming of the Bastille that announced a new world, lay the slow, grinding story of bread. To understand the French Revolution is to understand that its first cry was not liberté or égalité, but bread. It was a word shouted by the tired, the poor, and the endlessly patient women who spent their lives standing in line outside the boulangeries of Paris. The price of revolution in July 1789, the average price of a 4-pound loaf had risen to nearly 15 sous, more than half the daily wage of a skilled worker. When wages stagnated and flour supplies faltered, even the employed starved. The bakers themselves fared little better. They were caught between the wrath of the people and the scrutiny of officials. To raise prices risked violence, to lower them meant bankruptcy. Some locked their doors and fled. Others slept in their bakeries, armed with knives or wooden paddles, guarding their flour sacks as if they were treasure, and indeed they were. When mobs looted bakeries, they were not stealing gold but grain, the real currency of survival. The Women's March, it was not a nobleman, a soldier, or a philosopher who brought the revolution to the gates of Versailles. It was the baker's customers, On the morning of October 5, 1789, as cold rain fell over Paris, a rumour swept through the marketplaces: there was no bread. The bakers had none to sell. The people, mostly women, gathered in the streets, their patience finally spent. They began to march. At first it was hundreds, then thousands, then tens of thousands. Women carrying knives, broomsticks and pikes, housewives and washerwomen, servants and widows. Some had children in their arms. Others carried banners or dragged small cannons. Their cry was simple, repetitive, and unrelenting: bread! Bread for Paris. The march stretched for miles, from the city gates to the palace at Versailles. The road was muddy, the air thick with the smell of wet clothes and exhaustion. Along the way, soldiers joined them, some reluctantly, some with sympathy. By evening, the crowd stood before the golden gates of the king's palace. Inside, Louis XV dined in comfort. Marie Antoinette, often unfairly blamed for the famine, would later become the symbol of all royal excess. The queen who supposedly said, "Let them eat cake," though she never uttered the words. The women demanded that the king return to Paris, to face his starving people, and by dawn they got their wish. The baker, the baker's wife, and the little baker, as the royal carriage made its slow journey back to the capital, the crowd chanted a new refrain: "Nous ramenons le bolang riz, et le petit maitron." We are bringing back the baker, the baker's wife, and the little baker boy. It was a cruel and brilliant piece of street theatre. The king, queen, and their son were recast in the language of bread, the trade that fed and now judged them. Louis was the baker, the man responsible for supplying his people. Marie Antoinette was the baker's wife, seen as frivolous, greedy, and wasteful. Their young son, the Dauphin, was the little baker boy, the symbol of a future already spoiled by excess. By calling them bakers, the crowd was not flattering the monarchy. They were reminding it of its duty to feed the people or be consumed by them. Bread as a political weapon, when the king returned to Paris, his power did not return with him. The National Assembly took control of the grain supply. Local committees were formed to regulate prices and oversee distribution. Bakers were now under revolutionary supervision. Every loaf, every ounce of flour, every sale recorded and inspected. The maximum, a price cap introduced in 1793, fixed the cost of bread at a level intended to prevent starvation. But it also strangled the bakers' livelihoods. Those caught charging more faced imprisonment. Those caught hoarding could be accused of treason. And yet, despite the new laws, hunger persisted. The revolutionaries had replaced royal inspectors with patriotic ones, but the bread remained scarce. Flour was still dependent on weather, on transport, on the slow grind of mills and the chaos of war. When armies marched, they consumed more than bullets. They consumed bread. As France went to war with Europe, the grain stores of the countryside fed soldiers first and civilians second. In the city, long lines formed once again outside bakeries. The faces had changed. New leaders, new flags, new slogans. But the hunger was the same. The revolutionary bakeries under the new order. The bakeries themselves became sites of propaganda. Posters adorned their doors, urging citizens to be patient, patriotic, and frugal. "Eat less white bread," one declared, "so that the Republic may eat more." Flour was often mixed with other grains, rye, barley, even chestnut flour, producing dark, heavy loaves called pain galate or quality bread. It was a gesture of shared sacrifice, rich and poor alike eating the same coarse food. But equality in hunger is still hunger. In the poorer districts, bakers sometimes refused to bake at all, fearing mobs if they ran out. Others were accused of sabotage or counter-revolution. There were trials, even executions, for those found guilty of monopoly of grain. A vague crime that could mean anything from hoarding flour to baking secretly for friends. In one infamous case, a Paris baker named Denis Franois was lynched in 1793 by a crowd who believed he was hiding bread from sale. His shop was looted, his flour scattered in the street. When the mob realized their mistake, that he had simply run out of stock, it was too late. The revolution had made bread sacred, and to deny it was blasphemy. The queen and the guillotine, Marie Antoinette, the baker's wife, of the crowd's chant, was imprisoned in the temple and later tried for treason. Her trial was a spectacle of bitterness. The prosecutors accused her of corruption, extravagance, and indifference to the people's suffering. To the end, she denied that she had ever spoken the infamous phrase, "Quils mangent de la brioche," but truth mattered little. The words had already become myth, a myth shaped by hunger and resentment. When the blade fell on October 16, 1793, there was no bread in many parts of Paris. Some said the people cheered, others said they simply watched in silence. The Queen's death did not fill the ovens, yet in a grim way, it closed a circle the revolution had begun with women demanding bread, and it now consumed the woman blamed for its absence. The weight of hunger by the height of the Reign of Terror, the line between justice and survival blurred completely. To criticize the government's management of grain could be taken as an act of counter-revolution. Even complaints in the marketplace were dangerous. Still, people murmured. Hunger cannot be legislated away. In 1794, a new decree ordered the requisition of all grain for the army, leaving civilians to ration what remained. In some districts, the daily bread ration fell to less than £0.5 per person. People ate anything that could be ground into flour, beans, acorns, even powdered bones. The bakers, once vital tradesmen, became prisoners of policy. Their ovens were now instruments of the state. They baked when ordered, sold at fixed prices, and delivered to officials. Flour was issued by permit. To bake privately was illegal, and yet they baked. Because to stop was unthinkable. The return of the loaf. When Robespierre fell and the terror ended, Paris exiled. The new government relaxed the grain controls, allowing prices to fluctuate again. For a brief moment, bakeries flourished, or at least survived. The people, wary of ideology, wanted only stability. The cry for bread became quieter, replaced by the dull rhythm of rebuilding. But the memory of hunger lingered. It haunted the new republic like a ghost. Those who had lived through it spoke of bread not as food, but as history, the measure of justice and injustice alike. Every law, every speech, every promise of liberty was weighed against a single question: can we eat? As the revolution devoured its leaders and the city settled into its uneasy calm, the smell of baking bread returned to the streets. The same smell that had begun the storm, yet beneath that familiar scent lay a quiet unease. The monarchy was gone, but the hunger that destroyed it remained. And so, in a world remade by ideals of equality and reason, a simple, unanswerable question lingered like the heat of an extinguished oven. When the guillotine finally stopped falling, and the fever of revolution gave way to exhaustion, Paris found itself hungry again. Not for liberty or vengeance, but for stability, for bread that did not come with fear. The ovens of the city had never truly gone cold. Through every riot, famine, and regime, they had continued to burn. But the bread that came out of them after 1795 was no longer the same. It was the bread of survivors, rough, improvised, and wary, made by people who had seen too much. The Republic of Bakers in the years after Robespierre's fall, the Directory government tried to impose order on chaos. France was still at war, still broke and still haunted by hunger. But for the first time in years, bakers could set their own prices again. Freedom for them was a strange luxury. Many had forgotten how to operate outside of government control. Some flourished, others failed. The old guilds, once powerful, then abolished during the revolution, were gone. Anyone could now call themselves a baker. It was, in theory, a victory for liberty. In practice, it created a kind of anarchy. Bakeries multiplied across Paris, but quality collapsed. Adulteration was rampant. To stretch their meager flour, bakers mixed in everything from sawdust to ground peas and alum. The loaves looked pale, felt light, and caused stomach pain that no one could name. Inspectors returned, this time as public health officers. The people grumbled, remembering the old days when, even under kings, a loaf had to meet the standard weight. Liberty, it turned out, had its own kind of hunger. Napoleon's bread in 1799, Napoleon Bonaparte seized power. He was not sentimental about bread, but he understood its power. An army, he famously said, marches on its stomach, and a city, he knew, can revolt on an empty one. Under the Consulate and later the Empire, the regulation of bread returned, not out of mercy, but out of military necessity. Napoleon reorganized the grain supply, built granaries, and standardized flour production. Bakers were once again watched and licensed. But now, instead of priests or nobles, their overseers were uniformed bureaucrats of the new state. The emperor's system was pragmatic: ensure steady supply, fix prices in crisis, and keep the ovens burning. It worked. Paris no longer starved. And yet something was lost. Where bread had once been the daily drama of politics, the measure of justice and oppression alike, it now became routine, a quiet function of administration. The revolutionary fervor cooled into habit. But that, perhaps, was the point. After years of blood and chaos, the people were content to let bread become boring again. The rise of the white loaf. By the 1820s, France was changing faster than its bakers could knead. New mills powered by water and steam replaced the ancient grindstones. Sifters produced finer flour. The result was a new kind of bread, lighter, whiter, softer. It was called pain blanc, and it became a symbol of progress. To eat white bread was to eat the future. It was also for many to forget the past. The dark, coarse loaves of the revolutionary years, the taste of scarcity and survival. But not everyone could afford this new refinement. White flour cost more to produce. The working class continued to eat darker loaves, while the middle and upper classes adopted the pale, elegant baguettes that would soon define Parisian baking. Bread, once the common bond of all, quietly became a marker of class. In the words of one observer, "Tell me the color of your bread, and I will tell you who you are." The baker's night, the industrial age, brought new machines, but it did not ease the life of the baker. If anything, it made it harsher. To have bread ready for the morning, bakers began their work at midnight. The rhythm of the city turned upside down for them. While Paris slept, they mixed, kneaded, and tended their ovens. Their eyes reddened from smoke and exhaustion. They were known as les travailleurs de la nuit, the workers of the night. Their shops were small and hot, the air heavy with yeast. Water had to be carried by hand. Flour dust coated everything, even their lungs. Many died young from respiratory illness, and yet despite the toil they remained proud. The baker was not an artist, not a philosopher, but a craftsman who fed the city, a survivor of kings and revolutions alike. The smell of fresh bread at dawn became a sign that life continued. It was the quiet assurance that, whatever else might change, the city would still eat. Bread and the new poor. By the 1830s, Paris had swelled with migrants from the countryside, workers seeking jobs in factories, laborers building the new boulevards. They lived in cramped tenements, often too poor to buy fresh loaves. Bakers adapted. They began selling pain de second, a cheaper, darker bread made from lower quality flour. Some sold leftover crusts by the handful. Philanthropists and reformers studied the city's diet with scientific precision. Reports measured the caloric value of each kind of bread, calculating the minimum required for survival. It was an era obsessed with efficiency, even in hunger. In a sense, bread had become depersonalized. What had once been a symbol of justice and rebellion was now a matter of arithmetic. How many calories a worker needed to avoid starvation, how many loaves a bakery could produce per hour. The revolution had humanized hunger, industry made it mechanical. Taxes, again even as production expanded, the familiar old problem returned: taxation. Flour ovens, licenses, even delivery carts were taxed. Parisian bakers joked bitterly that the only thing untaxed was the air they breathed, though even that was thick with soot from the mills. By the 1840s, political pamphlets once again used bread as metaphor. But now, instead of calling for liberty, they called for labor reform. The worker does not ask for charity. One read. He asks for the right to earn his bread. Bread, once the trigger of revolution, had become the language of industry. The baguette begins, the long, slender loaf that the world now associates with France. The baguette emerged slowly during this period. It was not yet called by that name, but bakers were experimenting with new shapes and methods made possible by refined flour and improved ovens. These early sticks of bread baked faster, cooled faster, and could be sold fresh each morning. Their crisp crust and airy crumb were the taste of modernity. To walk through Paris at sunrise and hear the crackle of cooling loaves was to feel that progress had arrived in the most ordinary way imaginable. The baguette, in its quiet perfection, was the opposite of revolutionary bread. It was not a symbol of equality, but of routine comfort, a sign that France had finally found peace in its daily bread. Memory and crumbs, and yet, the old memories lingered. Every so often, during times of bad harvest or economic strain, the people still gathered in the streets. They still shouted about the price of bread. The word carried centuries of meaning: hunger, dignity, justice, rebellion. To say, "we want bread," was to summon ghosts. Older Parisians could still recall their grandmothers' stories of 1789, of waiting in endless lines, of riots and rumors of the women who marched to Versailles with knives and brooms. Those memories became legend. They reminded the city that behind every law, every reform, every modern convenience, there was a simple truth: civilization rests on the crust of a loaf. The quiet empire of bread. By mid-century, Paris had become a city of order. The boulevards were wider, the markets cleaner, the bakeries brighter. Industrial flour mills along the Seine hummed day and night, feeding the appetite of millions. Bread was no longer a political threat. It was a habit, a comfort, a constant presence. And yet, in its very ordinariness lay its power. Every worker's breakfast, every soldier's ration, every family meal reaffirmed the social contract that had once nearly crumbled over the price of a loaf. The government no longer feared bread riots, not because the people were content, but because they were finally fed. For the first time in living memory, Hunger no longer ruled the streets of Paris. The last reflection, if you walk the old quarters today, along the Rue Saint Antoine or the Marais, you can still find bakeries standing on the same foundations as those of the 18th century. Their ovens have been rebuilt, their recipes refined, but their purpose is unchanged. Each loaf they sell carries a history of labor, survival, and quiet revolution. The bakers of Paris, once accused of treason and hoarding, now perform their work in peace. They rise before dawn, shape the dough, tend the fire. The air fills with that familiar scent: flour, yeast, warmth. Few who pass by think of the centuries of hunger, of the kings and mobs and ministers who fought over the price of a crust. But in every bite of bread, that history lives on, softened and forgotten, like a crumb melting on the tongue. The revolution began with bread and ended with it. The same humble necessity, the same eternal demand. Imagine the world before silence, before telegraphs, before printing presses, before any hum of wires or distant ringing bells. In this older world, news moved at the speed of a galloping horse, and even that was a miracle. At the height of its power, the Roman Empire stretched from the misted highlands of Britain to the deserts of Arabia, from the Rhine to the Nile. It governed some 60 million people, most of whom would never see the emperor, yet all of whom were bound to him by roads, taxes, and letters. And among all the empire's triumphs, the aqueducts, the arenas, the marble cities, few were as quietly revolutionary as its postal service, the cursus publicus. It was, in its way, the nervous system of Rome, invisible, tireless, and utterly essential. The invention of the road. Every empire begins with a line in the dirt. Rome's lines were its roads. By the time Augustus, the first emperor, came to power in 27 BCE, Rome had already built thousands of miles of stone-paved highways. They crossed mountains, bridged rivers, and ran arrows straight across the plains. The famous saying, "All roads lead to Rome," was not a metaphor, it was a logistical truth. But the roads were not built for tourists or traders. They were built for control. Soldiers, messengers, and officials could move swiftly where peasants trudged. Augustus understood that conquest meant nothing without communication, and so he organized a new system, not of armies but of couriers. The birth of the cursus publicus, or public course, was Rome's official postal service. Established under Augustus and refined by his successors, it was designed to carry messages, orders, and reports across the empire with astonishing speed and reliability. Its structure was simple but brilliant. Along every major road, roughly every 8 to 12 Roman miles, 12-18 kilometers, stood a mutatio, a relay station where couriers could exchange tired horses for fresh ones. Every 25 to 30 miles stood a mansio, a rest station complete with stables, food, and lodging for authorized travelers. Each mansio was staffed by a small army of innkeepers, stable boys, cooks, and scribes. A few even had bathhouses for the comfort of imperial messengers. The couriers themselves were drawn from the ranks of trusted slaves or freedmen. They carried diplomas, bronze elite tokens stamped with the emperor's seal, granting them the right to requisition horses and lodging. Without a diploma, one could not legally use the service. To do so was theft of imperial property. Thus, from Britannia to Syria, the empire was bound together by these silent relays of hoofbeats, messages moving from one outpost to the next, each rider covering only a few hours' distance before handing off the scroll and turning back. The speed of empire. How fast could news travel in ancient Rome? A courier on the cursus publicus could cover 50 miles in a day on average, sometimes more on urgent missions. With relays, dispatches could travel over 150 miles a day. An imperial order could reach Gaul from Rome in about a week, Egypt in 10 days, and the distant Danube frontier in less than 2. For a world without wheels of wire or engines of steam, it was astonishing. Through this network, emperors ruled their provinces. Governors sent tax reports, generals sent requests for reinforcements, and spies whispered warnings of unrest. And, as in all bureaucracies, a vast amount of paper moved for reasons no one could quite explain. Endless inventories, schedules, and letters confirming that previous letters had been received. Even in its efficiency, the Roman postal system had already discovered the true spirit of paperwork. The daily life of a Roman courier. If you were a courier in the cursus publicus, your world was narrow but vital. You began at dawn, reporting to the stationmaster. Your horse would already be saddled, the message sealed with wax and bound in leather to protect it from dust and rain. You carried no weapons, only the authority of the emperor's seal. The roads were both friend and enemy. In summer they baked, in winter they froze. A misstep on a slippery cobble could break a leg, yours or the horse's. Bandits were rare but not unheard of. Most feared the punishment of robbing an imperial messenger execution without trial. Yet, in the far provinces, accidents just happened. Horses went lame. Scrolls disappeared. News arrived conveniently late. Every courier knew the weight of his cargo. A single message could change a governor, condemn a city, or save a general from disgrace. And yet, for all that power, the courier himself remained anonymous. A shadow on the road, one of thousands who kept the empire talking to itself. The stations and their keepers, the mansions were the quiet hearts of the system. From the outside, they looked like small forts. Thick walls and inner courtyards, stables, sometimes even a watchtower. Inside they were bustling with the small chores of empire, feeding horses, repairing carts, cleaning harnesses. Each station had a praepositus casualium, or postmaster, responsible for managing the horses and ensuring every message moved on schedule. Their work was endless, their recognition non-existent. A well-run mancio was one that no one noticed. Where the couriers came and went, the ledgers stayed balanced, and the empire's pulse remained steady. Letters were copied, sealed, and sent. Supplies were recorded, hay, oil, grain, candles. The Roman Empire, for all its grandeur, ran on an endless stream of lists. The emperor's eyes for the emperors, the postal network was more than a convenience. It was power itself. Through it flowed not just information, but control. Orders could be sent to far-flung provinces within days. Reports could return almost as quickly. This made rebellion difficult. A governor might rise in defiance, but Rome would know before his banners were unfurled. Troops could be mobilized before the revolt spread. In time, the cursus publicus became a tool of surveillance as well as communication. Spies and informants used it to send coded reports back to the capital. Governors complained that their every word was read before it reached the emperor. And, of course, messages traveled both ways. A careless official might receive, by return courier, a short, final note, "The emperor is displeased." In such moments, the click of approaching hooves was enough to make even the proudest man tremble. The burden of maintenance, the efficiency of the cursus publicus came at a heavy cost. Each province was required to maintain its section of the system, providing horses, fodder, and labor. For wealthy cities, this was a matter of pride. For poorer villages, it was a crushing tax. Complaints filled the surviving records, roads neglected, animals exhausted, supplies stolen. Some governors begged to be relieved of the duty. Others used it as a tool of punishment, assigning the burden to communities that had angered them. A historian of the 3rd century noted bitterly, "The people give their beasts, their carts, their hay, and receive only dust in return." Even in the empire's most bureaucratic triumph, one can hear the murmur of resentment from below. Messages that shaped history through this system passed some of the most fateful words ever written. In 68 CE, the governor of Hispania, Servius Galba, received a message through the cursus publicus Emperor Nero was dead. By the next week, another message arrived, naming Galba emperor in his place. During the Jewish revolt, dispatches carried news of battles across the desert roads of Judea, reports that would later fill the histories of Tacitus and Josephus. When Pliny the Younger served as governor in Bithynia, his letters to Emperor Trajan, all sent by the imperial post, ranged from the management of aqueducts to the punishment of Christians. Each response, each imperial decree, was borne by some nameless courier whose name history forgot. Without them, the empire's voice would have been silent. The quiet reach of the post by the 2nd century CE, the cursus publicus had reached its peak. From the far edge of Hadrian's Wall to the sands of Egypt, a traveler could find the same stone milestones, the same relay stations, the same rules. It was, in every sense, the first global network. And like all networks, it carried more than official business. Personal letters, merchant contracts, love notes, and small packages found their way onto the imperial roads, hidden among the authorized scrolls. Such smuggling was illegal, of course. But where there are roads, there are always travelers willing to bend the rules. The Roman Empire, it seems, also invented the black market courier. The horse is slow, the stations hum with quiet industry, and the empire holds its breath, stretched across continents, bound by roads and wax seals. The couriers ride on, each carrying a message that might shape a province or change a life. But beneath the rhythm of hoofbeats lies an unsettling question, one that no emperor could ignore forever. The great machine of the cursus publicus, that invisible lattice of horses, stations, and scribes had once run with the steady rhythm of a heartbeat. But hearts tire, even the strongest must slow. By the middle of the 2nd century CE, the Roman Empire was vast beyond imagination. It had reached its greatest size under Emperor Trajan, stretched stretching from the Atlantic to the Persian Gulf. And yet, the very success of the system that once connected it began to strain its own foundations. Messages still moved, but not as quickly. Reports grew late, couriers grew old, and letters began to pile on the wrong tables. It was a slow decay, not a collapse, but a thickening silence. The weight of distance. Imagine being a governor in a far province, say, in Dacia or Syria. You have a rebellion brewing on the frontier, a tax shortfall in the cities, and an imperial inspector demanding a report by the end of the month. You dispatch a messenger through the cursus publicus. The scroll is sealed with wax and stamped with your ring. You send it on its way, imagining that in a few weeks, the emperor himself will read your words in Rome. But the roads are no longer safe, the horses are thin. The mutatio stations have lost their funding, and so, days stretch into weeks, weeks into months. By the time your message reaches the capital, the situation on the ground has already changed, and the reply, when it finally comes, is useless. Distance, once conquered, begins to reassert itself, the hidden corruption it began, as so many things do, with small conveniences. Station masters, those humble keepers of empire, discovered that the right favors could make them rich. Merchants and wealthy travelers, forbidden to use the cursus publicus, would pay handsomely for the use of fresh horses and imperial roads. The postmasters began to sell diplomas, the bronze seals that allowed official travel. A counterfeit diploma could buy a journey across provinces in comfort, under the pretense of government duty. Soon, every level of the system found a way to profit. Horses were sold for private use. Feed and oil went missing. The road crews who maintained the stations disappeared from the payroll, but not from the records. For an empire built on bureaucracy, corruption was not chaos, it was camouflage. Everything continued to function, but less well, less honestly, less swiftly. A report from the reign of Diocletian laments, the couriers ride for merchants, not magistrates. The stations serve pleasure, not duty. The empire's voice grows faint, though the roads still echo with hooves. The emperors who tried to fix it, no emperor could ignore the silence forever. From time to time, reformers tried to restore the system. Under Hadrian, a man obsessed with order, the stations were audited, the horses counted, the staff retrained. For a brief while, the system ran as it had in Augustus's day, swift, efficient, proud. But empires age faster than men. By the 3rd century, when crisis after crisis struck, the Germanic invasions, the Persian Wars, the plague, the imperial budget collapsed. Roads were left unrepaired, bridges washed away, and outposts abandoned. Emperor Diocletian, ruling at the turn of the 4th century, tried once again to impose discipline. He issued detailed laws about who could use the cursus publicus, how much fodder could be consumed, even how many candles could be burned at each station. He divided the empire into smaller administrative units, hoping that tighter local control would mean faster communication. But bureaucracy breeds paper faster than it breeds efficiency. Inspectors wrote reports about missing reports, clerks copied orders already outdated, and couriers rode themselves to exhaustion, carrying messages that no one had time to read. The Roman Empire had created not just a postal service, but the world's first administrative labyrinth. The human cost to maintain the cursus publicus was not only a matter of paperwork, it was a burden that crushed the people beneath it. Each province was still responsible for supplying the animals, fodder, and manpower to keep the stations running. But as the empire's wealth declined, that obligation became ruinous. In Egypt, papyri survive listing the yearly quotas of donkeys, camels, and carts demanded by the post. The scribes who recorded them wrote in wary, mechanical hands, tallies of suffering. In one such record, a village of 200 families is ordered to provide 6 camels and their handlers for the transport of imperial letters. The animals are never returned. In Gaul, small farmers abandoned their land to avoid the angaria, the compulsory service of transporting postal wagons. The system that once unified the empire now drained it. Messages that never arrived in times of peace. Delay was an inconvenience. In times of crisis, it was fatal. When the Antonine plague swept through the empire in the 2nd century, news of outbreaks traveled unevenly. Some cities had time to prepare, others learned only when the dead arrived. Later, in the 3rd century, crisis of the empire, communication between frontiers broke down almost entirely. Governors acted without instruction, generals declared themselves emperors, and messages from Rome went missing in the chaos of civil war. By the time Constantine rose to power in the early 4th century, the cursus publicus was a ghost of its former self, still there in name but unreliable in function. And yet, even ghosts can be useful. Constantine, ever the practical ruler, used the system not merely for messages, but for control. He appointed new postmasters loyal to him, turning the postal service into a kind of surveillance arm. If letters were intercepted or read along the way, that was not considered a failure. It was intelligence. The same system that once carried the emperor's orders now carried his fears. The roads grow quiet. Archaeologists tracing the remnants of the Roman roads often find strange things. A milestone inscribed with the name of a forgotten emperor, a layer of ash where a mancio burned and was never rebuilt, a coin lost in the courtyard of a station that once fed a dozen horses. By the late 4th century, many of these stations had simply stopped functioning. The stones remained, but the staff did not. In the absence of imperial couriers, local messengers took over, monks, merchants, and private travelers carrying letters on their own initiative. The grand web of empire dissolved into a patchwork of local routes, each one fragile and uncertain. To send a message across the empire was again to trust in luck and strangers. The sound of hoofbeats in the dark still, some couriers rode on. In the quiet of night, under the moonlight of the old Roman roads, they continued their lonely work. Their horses' hooves echoed against the stone, soft, rhythmic, hypnotic. They passed ruins and milestones alike, carrying messages that no longer mattered to an empire that could no longer listen. Sometimes, in letters from the late empire, one can still sense the ghost of the old system. A bishop writes to another, "I have sent this letter by the public course, though I know not if it still runs." It is a sentence both factual and poetic, the admission that the empire still pretended to be whole, even as it came apart. The last orders in the year 376, a message left Constantinople, the new imperial capital, bound for the Danube frontier. It ordered the local commanders to admit a group of Gothic refugees across the river, starving families fleeing from the Huns. The letter arrived. The Goths were allowed in. What followed was a disaster: famine, corruption, rebellion, and finally open war. 2 years later, in 378 CE, the Roman army was destroyed at the Battle of Adrianople. The Emperor Valens was killed, and the empire would never recover. It was not the fault of the messenger, of course, but one cannot help wondering how much of the misunderstanding, how much of the delay, confusion, and mistranslation came from the slow and broken arteries of the empire's communication. A message can build an empire, but a message loss can end one. Echoes on the road as the Western Empire crumbled, the cursus publicus faded into legend. The Eastern Empire, centered in Constantinople, preserved parts of it for centuries longer, calling it the cursus velox and cursus clabularis, the fast course and the heavy course. Even there, the couriers grew fewer, the horses slower, the messages rarer, and yet, the dream of the Roman post never vanished. The idea that a vast land could be connected by steady, reliable communication, by the predictable rhythm of distance, lingered long after the empire was dust. Centuries later, when the Holy Roman Empire, the Ottomans, and even the modern European states built their own postal systems, they traced invisible lines over the same roads. Each claimed innovation, each merely rediscovered what Rome had already known. That power is not held by armies, but by information. The hoofbeats fade now, somewhere beyond the horizon of history. The roads are broken, the stations are gone. But if you stand on an old Roman road at night, and the wind shifts just right, you might still hear the echo of a courier riding through the dark, carrying a message that will never arrive. And that echo leaves us with one question, still unanswered after 2,000 years. When the Roman Empire in the West finally fell in the 5th century, the world did not end. It merely became quieter. The legions no longer marched, the couriers no longer galloped. The great roads that once tied together provinces and peoples began to break apart under the slow, patient work of time. Grass grew between the stones of the Via Appia. Bridges sagged into rivers. The milestones, those proud declarations of distance and imperial order, toppled and sank into the mud. But even as the empire's body decayed, its nervous system, the idea of long-distance communication, survived, flickering like a faint pulse in the dark. The silence of the roads after Rome's collapse. Europe became a patchwork of kingdoms, tribes, and forgotten towns. The infrastructure of empire, aqueducts, baths, roads, and stations, no longer had a central authority to maintain it. The cursus publicus was gone. The couriers, unpaid, turned to other work. The horses were sold, the relay stations abandoned, their stones scavenged for churches and fortresses. Travel became dangerous again. A messenger might cross the Alps or the Pyrenees not in days, but in weeks, and with no guarantee of arrival. A letter might never reach its reader. And yet, some people still wrote. In monasteries, far from the ruins of Rome, monks took up the burden of correspondence. They wrote to other abbeys, to bishops, and occasionally to kings. The monastic network that spread across medieval Europe became the quiet heir to the Roman postal dream. Letters traveled by foot, on donkey back, or by the hands of pilgrims and merchants, each one a small act of defiance against isolation. The monk's letter in a monastery like Cluny or Monte Cassino, writing a letter was a sacred duty. The monk would sit at a wooden desk, quill in hand, dipping into ink made from oak galls and soot. The parchment was precious, scraped animal skin, so every word was deliberate. Messages concerned not politics, but the mundane, the price of grain, the repair of a wall, the safe arrival of a travelling brother. When the letter was ready, it was rolled, tied with a strip of cord, and sealed with wax pressed by a signet ring. A trusted traveller, a fellow monk, a pilgrim, or a hired messenger, would carry it sometimes for hundreds of miles. The journey might take weeks. Along the way, the messenger would stop at abbeys and monasteries, welcomed with bread, cheese, and rest. In that slow rhythm of hospitality and movement, the first faint echo of the cursus publicus returned, not by decree, but by devotion. The king's messengers. By the time of the Carolingian Empire in the 8th century, kings began to rediscover the power of organized communication. Charlemagne, ruling over what was once the heart of the Western Empire, issued capitularies, written laws, that he expected to be read and obeyed across his vast territories. To ensure their delivery, he appointed royal messengers called missi dominici, the Lord's envoys. These men travelled from court to court, carrying scrolls, reports, and letters. They were more than couriers, they were the eyes and ears of the king. Each missus rode with the authority of both church and crown. Each message they carried was both command and connection, a faint but deliberate imitation of the Roman cursus publicus. It was not as fast, nor as organized, but it was something new, a communication system born not of empire, but of faith and feudal obligation. The roads, though crumbling, began to hum again. Merchants and the message, while monks and kings carried their words for duty and salvation. It was the merchants who truly brought the road back to life. Trade returned in trickles, first along rivers, then across mountains, and finally through the great medieval fairs of Champagne, Bruges, and Genoa. With trade came contracts, letters of credit, and the need for reliable messengers. By the 12th century, merchant families like the Medici and the Fuggers had developed their own private courier systems, connecting cities from Florence to London. They hired riders, built inns, and kept horses at regular intervals, unknowingly recreating in miniature the mansions and mutations of Rome. Their riders carried not decrees, but something far more powerful in the medieval world: information. The rise and fall of grain prices, the sailing dates of fleets, the changing alliances of kings. It was through these private posts that Europe learned, once again, to speak in the language of commerce and correspondence. The papal couriers, meanwhile, the church built its own empire of paper. By the 13th century, the papacy in Rome had developed a vast bureaucracy, issuing bulls, indulgences, and decrees to clergy across Europe. To move these messages, the popes relied on a network of trusted couriers known as cursores Romani. They wore the sign of the cross on their cloaks and carried papal letters sealed with leaden bulli. Through them, Rome once again sent its voice across the continent, not the voice of emperors this time, but of popes. The system was astonishingly efficient. Letters could move from Avignon to Paris in less than 2 weeks, faster than most armies could march. And though the riders no longer bore the eagle of the cursus publicus, they carried its spirit, the disciplined rhythm of information across distance. The age of paper, around the 14th century, paper began to replace parchment. Cheaper, lighter, easier to produce. And with paper came more letters, more contracts, more bureaucracy. City-states like Venice, Florence, and Milan built their own postal offices. Small, dusty rooms near the docks or markets, where scribes tallied correspondence and sealed it with twine. One could, for a fee, hire a courier to deliver a message anywhere within the city walls, or farther, if the payment was good. The post was becoming public again, though it would take another century for governments to formalize it. Still, the ghost of the Roman roads was present in every detail: the relay, the seal, the official courier, the ledger. The system had been reborn slowly, through habit rather than memory. The renaissance of the road in the 15th century, a new family rose to power not through war, but through communication. The Thurnuntaxis, originally imperial couriers serving the Holy Roman Emperors, they organized one of Europe's first international postal networks. Their stations stretched from Brussels to Innsbruck, from Venice to Vienna. Hundreds of miles of organized relays, all operating with remarkable precision. At each station, horses were kept ready, riders were paid, and logs were maintained. All familiar practices to anyone who had once served in the cursus publicus. The Thurnum taxis system became the foundation of the modern European postal service. Their family motto might well have echoed a Roman sentiment. Without message, there is no empire. The memory of Rome. By the dawn of the 16th century, Europe was rediscovering Rome, not just its ruins, but its ideas. Scholars pored over old manuscripts, copying Latin inscriptions and admiring the geometry of Roman roads. Maps once again traced the Via Appia, the Via Flaminia, and the Via Augusta. Travelers walked the same stones that couriers had trod 15 centuries earlier, and with each rediscovery came a quiet recognition Rome had not vanished. It had only been translated, from empire to monastery, from monastery to merchant, from merchant to monarch. The hoofbeats had changed, but the rhythm was the same. The endless message communication, once invented, cannot die. The courier became the postman became the telegraph operator, the telegraph became the fiber optic cable. The medium changes, but the need endures. We still live in the shadow of those first Roman roads, our highways often tracing their routes, our bureaucracies echoing their forms. Every stamp, every delivery schedule, every signature of receipt owes something to the cursus publicus. The empire itself may be long gone, but the world it imagined, a world where information moves faster than people, is the one we now inhabit. The roads are quiet now, but if you listen closely, not to the traffic or the hum of machines, but beneath them, you might still hear the faint rhythm of iron shoes on stone. The courier is still riding, the message is still moving, and history, it seems, is still trying to deliver itself. So perhaps the question is not whether an empire can survive silence, but whether we, with all our noise, can still hear the meaning of the message that started it all. Imagine a narrow London street in the year 1800. The air smells faintly of coal smoke and wet wool. A sign swings gently above a dim doorway, ladies and gentlemen's garments shown and mended. Inside, beneath the light of a single candle, a young woman bends over a table sewing. Her name doesn't matter. It could be Mary or Anne or Jane. There were thousands like her. She is a seamstress. And through her hands, through every stitch, every needle prick, every sleepless night, runs the fabric of an empire. The quiet industry of thread before machines, before the thunder of factories. Every shirt, every sail, every red coat of the British Army was made by hand. By 1750, Britain was already a world of cloth. Wool from Yorkshire, linen from Ireland, cotton from India. Each material travelled across oceans and counties before reaching the needle. Cloth was not merely a commodity, it was civilization itself. To weave and to sew was to participate in the rhythm of the nation. And in that rhythm, women were both invisible and indispensable. From rural cottages to city workshops, women stitched garments for soldiers, servants, merchants, and gentry. They worked by candlelight, often 16 hours a day, earning just enough to afford bread, coal, and rent for a shared room. They did not march in parades or write their names in history. But without them, no army would have been clothed, no navy equipped, no gentleman properly dressed. The empire's glory began at a sewing table. The seamstress and the soldier in the mid-18th century. Britain's expansion overseas demanded armies, and armies demanded uniforms. Each regiment had its own tailor, but the bulk of the work, the cutting, stitching, buttoning, fell to women working from home or in small workshops. In London, Portsmouth, and Manchester, government contracts went out to master tailors, who then subcontracted the labour to hundreds of women. The redcoats that marched through India, Canada, and the Caribbean were stitched not in barracks but in cramped London rooms, their seams touched by the same hands that rocked cradles and washed floors. The women earned pennies per piece, often paid not in coin, but in tickets redeemable at specific shops owned by the contractors themselves. The thread of empire, it turned out, was double, stitched with exploitation. Cotton, the empire's fabric. The story of British sewing cannot be told without cotton. Before the Industrial Revolution, cotton was a luxury, imported in small quantities from India, where it had been grown and woven for millennia. Indian calicos and muslins were light, colourful, and exquisitely made, so fine that British merchants could barely compete. By the 1720s, Parliament, fearing economic ruin, banned the import of most Indian cottons. And yet, the British craving for the material only grew, so the empire adapted. Raw cotton was imported from the colonies, first the Caribbean, then, increasingly, from the American South. It was spun and woven in Britain's new textile mills, Grimm, thunderous buildings filled with noise and dust. When the cloth emerged, it returned to women like Mary, who turned it into shirts, dresses, and uniforms. The global circuit was complete: Indian knowledge, African labor, American plantations, British factories, and women's hands. Each stitch was part of a system larger than any one person could see. The needle as survival for working-class women, sewing was often the last refuge against starvation. In cities like London, Manchester, and Glasgow, widows and unmarried women were excluded from most forms of paid labor. Sewing required no tools but a needle and thimble, small enough to fit in a pocket, and portable enough to carry from place to place. They worked for tailors, drapers, or slop sellers, merchants who supplied ready-made clothing to sailors and laborers. Others stitched for private clients, taking in mending or alterations. In winter, when daylight faded early, they worked by the dim orange glow of candles or oil lamps, the air heavy with smoke. Their eyes burned, their fingers bled, and their backs ached, but the needle never stopped. The pay was miserable: a few shillings a week, barely enough for food and lodging. In one 1821 survey, London seamstresses reported earning between 5 and 10 pence a day, less than half the cost of bread and coal. But still they sued, because the alternative was hunger. The world in a stitch, the empire depended on uniformity. British officers demanded identical coats, identical hats, identical insignia, visual proof of order and power. Sailors wore blue jackets and white trousers, soldiers wore red, colonial administrators wore linen suits in the tropics. Behind every buttonhole lay hours of invisible labor. For every regiment that marched, hundreds of women sat unseen, their fingers moving in rhythm, stitching not just cloth but empire itself. In London's East End, entire tenement streets became known for specific kinds of work: corset makers on one corner, glove makers on another, uniform stitchers in the back rooms of boarding houses. Children helped too, winding thread, sewing buttons, trimming fabric scraps. A girl of 8 might already be a skilled sewer, her hands small enough to turn tiny seams. To live in the empire's heart was to be surrounded by its cloth, worn, torn, mended, and reworn. The factory looms. In the late 18th century, everything changed. And yet, in another sense, nothing did. The invention of the spinning jenny, the water frame, and the power loom transformed Britain into the world's textile powerhouse. By 1800, cotton cloth had become the nation's most valuable export. But while machines took over spinning and weaving, the final act of sewing remained stubbornly human. The mills produced endless bolts of cloth, but each still needed to be cut, stitched, and finished by hand. So while men and children worked in the factories, women continued to labor in silence at home. The Industrial Revolution did not free the seamstress, it multiplied her work. The demand for cheap, ready-made clothing exploded. Uniforms for soldiers, shirts for laborers, dresses for servants. Factories produced the fabric, women turned it into life. The slop work system. By the early 19th century, Britain had developed a thriving slop work trade, the early ancestor of modern fast fashion. The term came from slops, or cheap, mass-produced garments sold to sailors and laborers. Merchants would deliver bundles of pre-cut cloth to women's homes, along with thread and instructions. Each garment was divided into dozens of small tasks: collars, cuffs, seams, buttonholes. Women were paid by the piece, not by the hour. When finished, the bundle would be collected, checked, and paid, often after long delays or arbitrary deductions. The women had no contracts, no unions, no security. If the merchant found a mistake, he could refuse payment entirely. They worked faster and faster, trying to make enough to survive. One writer in 1832 described visiting a London sewing room. There were 12 of them, pale as their needles, sewing as if for their lives, which, indeed, they were. Respectable poverty. To be a seamstress was both respectable and ruinous. Unlike factory girls or servants, seamstresses worked from home, a fact that preserved their social reputation, especially among the poor middle class. But that same isolation made their suffering invisible. There was no overseer to complain to, no collective voice, no camaraderie in the long hours of night. Many women went blind from eye strain, or coughed their lungs raw from the cold and damp. Some collapsed at their tables and were found days later, needles still in hand. The newspapers of the time sometimes published small notices. A young woman, a seamstress by trade, was discovered deceased in her lodgings, having partaken of no sustenance for several days. It was not news exactly. It was a quiet epidemic. The empire's shadow. Every empire has its margins, its invisible builders. For Britain, they were the women who sewed. They stitched the clothes of explorers and governors, the sheets of naval ships, the tents of colonial expeditions. They mended the garments of the dead and dressed the newborn in scraps of empire-made cloth. And though they never saw India or Jamaica or Africa, the materials of those lands passed daily through their hands. Cotton from Bengal, indigo from Madras, buttons from Birmingham, and brass buckles from Sheffield, all combined under the flicker of a candle in a rented London room. The empire was not just conquered abroad, it was sewn together at home. As the candle burns low, Mary pricks her finger again. A drop of blood stains the white cotton. She sighs, dabs it with a scrap, and keeps sewing. Outside, carriages rattle over the cobblestones. Somewhere, an officer tries on a new uniform, crisp, gleaming, and perfectly tailored. He will never know the name of the woman who made it. And she will never know where it goes. To India, perhaps, or to the Cape, or across the Atlantic. But the thread that connects them stretches across the world. And as the Industrial Revolution deepens, a question begins to rise with the hum of new machines. It began with a sound few people had ever heard before. A steady, metallic hum, rising and falling like a heartbeat made of steel. In 1830, a French tailor named Barthélemy Témoigné built a crude sewing machine that used a hooked needle and thread to create simple stitches. It worked, imperfectly, but enough to frighten other tailors. Within a year, his workshop in Paris was destroyed by an angry mob of craftsmen who believed the machine would take their jobs. The fear crossed the channel quickly. When reports of self-sewing contraptions reached Britain, they sounded almost like heresy. Sewing was not merely a task, it was a discipline, a gendered duty, a quiet necessity. For centuries, women's fingers had done what no machine could imitate: the flexible, forgiving work of shaping cloth to human form. But progress is not sentimental. By the 1850s, sewing machines were spreading through Britain, first in workshops, then in factories, and finally into homes. What had once been a purely manual art became an industrial process. The old world of Mary the seamstress was changing forever. The machine arrives early. British sewing machines were clumsy and expensive, imported from America or assembled by engineers in London and Birmingham. In 1851, Isaac Singer patented a model that could sew faster, straighter, and for longer hours than any human. Its iron foot pedal pumped rhythmically, its needle darting up and down like the tick of a clock. Singer's marketing was clever. He sold not only machines but the idea of modern womanhood. His advertisements showed cheerful wives sewing with ease, their children well dressed, their homes tidy. It was domestic liberation, or so it seemed. But in London's workrooms, the machine was something else entirely: a threat. Hand-sewing women were suddenly competing with mechanized labor. A machine could produce 5 times as many stitches per hour, and the factory owners knew it. Piecework rates plummeted. Many independent seamstresses were forced to take factory jobs, stitching shirts, trousers, and uniforms for wages even lower than before. The promise of progress came, as it often does, with a bill attached. The sweatshops of Whitechapel in the East End of London, the new garment workshops, grew fast and dark. Narrow rooms packed with sewing tables, iron frames, and dozens of women working in silence. The air filled with lint and the wear of hundreds of steel needles. By the 1860s, the needle trade was one of Britain's largest employers of women. Shirts, corsets, boots, military tunics, everything the empire needed passed through these rooms. But the work was relentless. 10, 12, sometimes 14 hours a day. The machines were heavy to operate, requiring constant foot pressure and precision handling. Many women developed leg cramps, back deformities, or respiratory illnesses from the dust. Supervisors patrolled the aisles, measuring output by the hour. A slow worker could be fined, dismissed, or replaced. A visitor to one London factory in 1875 described the scene: rows upon rows of pale girls, faces bent toward the needle, hair tied back with rags. The air trembles with motion, not a word is spoken. The only sound is the machine. It was progress made audible. A global web of fabric. The raw cotton that fed these factories came now from America, from the plantations of the Deep South, where enslaved laborers picked and ginned the fiber that would one day become British cloth. Even after the abolition of slavery, the trade continued, drawing cotton from Egypt, India, and the Sudan. Ships unloaded bales at Liverpool and Manchester, where they were spun into cloth and sent to sewing factories across Britain. Each piece of finished clothing might contain within it 1,000 hidden stories: a field in Georgia, a loom in Lancashire, a workshop in London. Empire was no longer just something Britain ruled. It was something it wore. And for women in the factories, each stitch was a connection to a world they could never see. They might sew linen suits bound for the Caribbean, or khaki trousers for India, or uniforms for colonial regiments in Africa. garments that travelled further than they ever would. Through their labour, Britain's presence was felt everywhere, quietly, materially, as fabric, as uniform, as identity. Respectability and ruin, the public image of the seamstress shifted during these years. Victorian society liked to imagine her as a moral, industrious figure, humble, clean, pious, and deserving of charity. Writers like Charles Dickens and Thomas Hood made her into a symbol of virtuous suffering. Hood's famous 1843 poem, The Song of the Shirt, opened with lines that echoed through London's parlours. With fingers weary and worn, with eyelids heavy and red, a woman sat in unwomanly rags, plying her needle and thread. The poem inspired donations, reform efforts, and sympathetic speeches, but little actual change. The seamstress became a moral tale, not a worker with rights, and as sewing moved into factories, her humanity faded even further. She became, in the eyes of industrial Britain, part of the machinery, interchangeable, tireless, silent. The very tool that was meant to save her labour instead bound her more tightly to it. Threads of resistance, not all women accepted this quietly. In the 1850s and 1860s, groups of tailoresses began organising in cities like London, Leeds and Glasgow. They met in church halls, reading rooms, and crowded tenement kitchens. At first, they were cautious, calling for fair wages for honest work. But over time, their demands grew bolder: limits on hours, health protections, the right to refuse exploitative contracts. By 1874, the London Ladies' Tailors Association had formed, representing women in the ready-made clothing industry. It was small, underfunded, and often ignored by male unions, but it marked a turning point. For the first time, the women who stitched the empire began to speak in their own voices. Leaflets circulated describing factory conditions, the stifling heat, the accidents with needles and presses, the exhaustion. They asked not for pity, but for justice. And slowly the world began to notice. The Great Exhibition and the Domestic Dream in 1851. The Great Exhibition opened in London's Crystal Palace, a vast celebration of industry and empire. Among the glittering displays of engines and telegraphs sat a curious object, a sewing machine. Crowds gathered to watch it in action, fascinated by its speed and precision. To the middle classes, it represented progress and domestic modernity, a device that could transform household work. Manufacturers soon began selling smaller models for home use, often on installment plans. By the 1870s, having a sewing machine in the home had become a sign of respectability. Women could mend clothing faster, make dresses for their families, even take in paid sewing without leaving the house. For many, it was genuine empowerment. For others, it simply meant that the boundary between home and factory blurred completely. The machine followed women everywhere, into their kitchens, parlours, and dreams. The hum of industry became the hum of domestic life. From needle to nation, sewing machines helped Britain clothe not just itself, but its empire. Military contracts demanded millions of garments annually, from tropical linen for India to wool coats for Canadian winters. The British Army's supply chain became one of the most complex logistical systems in the world. At its heart were the women in the garment factories, the cutters, pressers, finishers, and machinists. By 1880, the ready-made clothing industry employed nearly 500,000 people across Britain, 3/4 of them women. They stitched through wars, coronations, and economic crises. They worked through pregnancies, bereavement, and exhaustion. They stitched because the empire required it. Yet for all its grandeur, the British Empire was still held together by fragile threads, literal ones, woven and knotted by hands that history rarely remembered. The iron law of wages economists of the time often spoke of, the iron law of wages. The grim idea that workers would always be paid no more than what was necessary to survive. Nowhere was that law more visible than in the sewing trade. For every small rise in wages, a new machine, a new colony, or a new supply of cheap labour drove them back down. Irish immigrants in London worked for less, girls in rural Scotland worked for almost nothing. Even as the empire expanded, the women who made its garments remained poor, their lives marked by what one social investigator called respectable hunger. They lived in rooms without heat, ate bread and tea for supper, and sent coins home to families who would never see the empire's wealth. They stitched through hunger, through illness, through heartbreak. Because the work, however cruel, was endless. The empire's seam begins to tear. By the late 1870s, cracks were forming. Industrial accidents drew public outrage. Journalists began writing exposés of the sweating system, the exploitative chain of middlemen who profited from subcontracted female labour. Reformers like Annie Besant and Clementina Black began organising campaigns for women's factory rights. The emerging labour movement, though still dominated by men, began to take the garment workers' cause more seriously. The sound of the sewing machine, once the anthem of progress, became a symbol of exhaustion and exploitation. But within that sound also lay a strange power, the first notes of industrial solidarity. The women who had been scattered and silent for generations were beginning to find one another. They shared stories, compared wages, and realized how vast their numbers were. The thread of the empire, for so long drawn downward, began, very slowly, to pull upward. As the century